In the early decades of the 20th century, Japan's navy stood as a symbol of precision, discipline, and destiny. Forged in the crucible of modernization and driven by an island nation's need for survival, it was not merely a military force. It was Japan's declaration to the world that it had mastered the modern age. By 1941, few navies on Earth appeared more formidable. The Imperial Japanese Navy, or IJN, boasted a proud lineage that traced back to Tsushima, the 1905 battle where Japan stunned the world by annihilating the Russian Baltic Fleet. That single victory transformed Japan from a regional power into a global contender. It also planted the seed of a national conviction that through discipline, courage, and willpower, Japan could overcome any material disadvantage. But that conviction, born in triumph, would eventually blind its leaders to a harsh truth. Modern war was no longer decided by courage alone. It was now a contest of science, of machinery, of production capacity measured not in ships, but in equations and supply chains. By the late 1930s, that transformation was already underway, quietly, relentlessly, across the Pacific Ocean. In the United States, the Navy and its industrial partners were entering an era of unprecedented innovation. Aircraft carriers, radar, sonar, and mass production engineering were reshaping the very definition of sea power. Japan, meanwhile, despite its early technological brilliance, began to falter, not through incompetence or lack of talent, but through misalignment between ideology and industrial reality. Japan's engineers could design exquisite warships, vessels like the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, masterpieces of steel and engineering. But where American production lines could replicate a destroyer in weeks, Japan's shipyards could take months, even years. The nation's craftsmanship, once its greatest strength, became its Achilles heel. Every vessel was a work of art, but art does not scale in total war. Throughout the 1930s, as tensions escalated across Asia, Japan's naval leadership divided into two competing schools of thought. One faction, the traditionalists, still believed the decisive battle would come from massive surface engagements, battleships exchanging broadsides in a modern reenactment of Tsushima. The other, smaller and more forward-looking, saw the rise of aviation as the true future of naval warfare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto belonged to that latter group, a man of contradictions, deeply patriotic yet educated in America. Cautious yet daring, Yamamoto understood that Japan's survival hinged on innovation, not imitation. He warned his peers that a war with the United States would be a war of attrition, one Japan could not win unless it struck fast, decisively, and technologically. But even Yamamoto's foresight had limits. Japan could build carriers, but not the fuel to sustain them. It could train elite aviators, but not replace them quickly enough. It could design brilliant aircraft, but lacked the industrial flexibility to mass-produce improvements mid-war. These weren't strategic errors made in battle. They were systemic weaknesses, rooted in the nation's economic structure and political ideology. By 1938, Japan had already been at war in China for a year. The conflict consumed staggering amounts of fuel, munitions, and manpower. Yet Tokyo continued to expand its naval ambitions, launching new ships, expanding training programs, and envisioning a Pacific empire that would stretch from Manchuria to the Indian Ocean. But the war in China also exposed a truth that Japan's naval command quietly ignored. The empire's industrial base was straining. Its steel output was barely 1/10 of America's. Its oil reserves were dependent on imports, 80% of which came from the very nation it might soon confront. Factories that should have been designing radar sets or refining turbine engines were instead devoted to producing trucks and rifles for the army in China. And while the Imperial Navy trained its aviators to perfection, their replacement rate was catastrophically low. A single lost pilot represented not just a man, but years of irreplaceable experience. These cracks were invisible to the public, but not to Yamamoto. In 1939, he watched with deep concern as Europe erupted into war. German submarines, British destroyers, and the rise of radar warfare were changing naval doctrine overnight. The British Royal Navy was beginning to use radar to detect aircraft and ships beyond the horizon, technology that would redefine sea combat. Japan's scientists knew of radar's potential, but their work lagged behind. Despite promising experiments, the military bureaucracy was slow to adopt it. The naval staff saw radar as a supplement to existing doctrine, not a revolutionary tool. The result was a 2-year delay that would prove fatal. By the time Japan fully grasped the power of radar and the broader industrial implications of electronic warfare, the United States had already integrated these systems across fleets, carriers, and air defense networks. In those 2 lost years, Japan's technological edge slipped away, quietly, almost imperceptibly, beneath the surface of bureaucratic tradition and national pride. Yamamoto himself foresaw the danger, but could not halt it. The Imperial Navy's culture prized secrecy, hierarchy, and tradition. Innovation required consensus, and consensus was slow. In contrast, the U.S. Navy fostered experimentation and inter-service cooperation. American engineers worked with universities and private companies. Data flowed freely across research networks. Mistakes were expected and corrected fast. Japan's system, however, feared mistakes. Each failure was personal, a mark of shame. As a result, the country's research programs stagnated, even as individual scientists made remarkable breakthroughs. For example, in 1940, Japanese physicists successfully built prototype radar systems capable of detecting aircraft up to 50 miles away, but the military refused to deploy them widely, arguing that visual spotting and radio coordination were sufficient. When Pearl Harbor struck in December 1941, Japan possessed only a handful of functioning radar sets. The U.S., meanwhile, had hundreds and was already developing airborne radar for its bombers. The imbalance was not just in machines, it was in mindset. This was the beginning of Japan's invisible collapse, a collapse that no one saw, not even those orchestrating the nation's greatest victories. Because in 1941, when Japan launched its lightning offensive across the Pacific, it seemed unstoppable. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. In just 6 months, Japan's navy conquered an empire stretching thousands of miles. It appeared to confirm the righteousness of its strategy and the invincibility of its forces. But in reality, those victories masked a profound fragility. Every successful attack consumed fuel, pilots, and equipment faster than Japan could replace them. Every new conquest widened the logistical burden. Japan's 2 lost years, the period between 1939 and 1941, were not years of peace. They were years of misdirection. While its enemies innovated, Japan perfected the wrong war. Behind the headlines of conquest, American factories were awakening. The United States had not yet fully entered the war. but its industry was already preparing for total mobilization. Aircraft carriers, escort vessels, destroyers, all rolling off assembly lines in quantities the world had never seen. Where Japan saw craftsmanship, America saw scalability. Where Japan designed one perfect fighter, America designed a dozen good ones and produced them by the thousands. In the end, numbers weren't just statistics. They were destiny. Yamamoto understood this better than anyone. In private, he warned Tokyo that Japan had at most 6 months of unchallenged success before the American power would become overwhelming. His prediction was tragically accurate. The first 6 months of 1942 would mark Japan's zenith and the beginning of its long decline. But that decline had begun long before the first carrier launched its planes over Pearl Harbor. It began in the laboratories that went unfunded, in the factories that built too slowly, and in the years when pride outweighed pragmatism. That is how an empire began to lose, not through defeat in battle, but through failure in preparation. 2 lost years hidden behind triumphs that quietly determined the fate of the Pacific. And in those years, Japan's navy, once the pride of an island empire, unknowingly set itself on a course toward destruction. The morning of December 8, 1941, brought news that electrified Tokyo. Pearl Harbor, America's Pacific fleet, lay in ruins. In a single stroke, Japan had achieved what no other power dared attempt. It had crippled the United States Navy at anchor. Across Japan, newspapers hailed it as divine victory. Crowds filled the streets, chanting Yamamoto's name. To them, the attack was proof that faith and audacity could overcome material limits. But to Yamamoto himself, there was no celebration. He had once written privately to a friend, "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, I have no expectation of success." He understood what few others in Tokyo did, that Pearl Harbor was not the end of Japan's struggle, but its beginning. It was an opening strike against a nation whose true weapon was not its fleet, but its factories. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, American shipyards went into overdrive. Production orders poured out across the country. New carriers, destroyers, submarines, all began construction in synchronized rhythm. By mid-1942, the first replacement vessels were already sliding down the ways. Japan, meanwhile, was at the height of its empire, controlling vast territories, but stretching its resources thin. Every new conquest required garrisons, convoys, and supply routes across thousands of miles of ocean. Fuel shortages began to appear just months after Pearl Harbor. Tankers were limited, refineries overworked, and captured oil fields in the Dutch East Indies yielded less than expected. The Imperial Navy found itself rationing fuel for training exercises, a small but deadly sign of things to come. In the early months of 1942, Japan's naval air arm, the pride of its fleet, remained unmatched. Its pilots were the most experienced in the world. Its aircraft, like the Mitsubishi A6M0, combined agility, range, and firepower in a way no Allied fighter could yet match. But even as these victories accumulated, another kind of attrition had begun. Invisible, statistical, but fatal. For every skilled Japanese aviator shot down, there were no replacements ready to take his place. Training programs had been built around quality, not quantity. A single pilot might spend years in rigorous preparation before qualifying for combat. By contrast, the United States had already begun building an industrialized training system. Hundreds of airfields, standardized instruction, and a continuous pipeline of new aviators. By the end of 1942, America was producing more pilots in a month than Japan could train in an entire year. The skies over the Pacific were becoming a numbers game, and Japan's arithmetic no longer added up. That spring, Yamamoto's fleet sailed toward a place few Americans had heard of, a small atoll called Midway. It was meant to be the next decisive blow, the trap that would draw out and annihilate what remained of the U.S. Navy's carriers. Japan's confidence was absolute. The Pearl Harbor victory had reinforced the illusion of strategic superiority. But Midway was not Pearl Harbor. By June 1942, American intelligence officers had already broken Japan's naval codes. They knew the target, the timetable, and the composition of Yamamoto's fleet. What Japan saw as perfect secrecy was in reality an open book. When the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu steamed east, they were sailing into a trap of their own making. On June 4th, as the sun rose over the Pacific, the Japanese carriers launched their first strike against Midway Island. The attack achieved modest success, but crucially, the decks of the carriers were still crowded with armed aircraft when American dive bombers appeared overhead. In a span of less than 6 minutes, Japan's naval air arm was shattered. 4 fleet carriers, the pride of the empire, exploded in sheets of fire and smoke. Hundreds of elite pilots perished. It was not just a defeat. It was the irreversible loss of Japan's offensive capability. The empire had entered a war of attrition, the very kind of war it could not win. Midway exposed the widening gap not only in intelligence, but in technology and adaptability. The United States had integrated code-breaking, radar, and rapid logistics into a single system, a system designed for speed and recovery. Japan, by contrast, had no central intelligence coordination. Its code systems were complex but inflexible. Once compromised, they remained so for months. In the aftermath of Midway, Yamamoto's staff studied the disaster in silence. Official reports emphasized tactical errors, poor luck, and the element of surprise. But the deeper causes were systemic: poor radar coverage, slow aircraft rearming procedures, inadequate damage control, and the fatal rigidity of command structure. The Imperial Navy had entered the war as an elite force built for short, decisive battles, but it was now trapped in a long war that demanded flexibility, mass production, and constant adaptation. In all 3 areas, Japan was falling behind. By late 1942, the turning point had begun. The U.S. Navy, once crippled, was now returning in strength. The new Essex-class carriers, larger, faster, and more resilient, were entering service. American shipyards, untouched by bombing and powered by endless industrial reserves, were launching a new carrier every month. Japan, meanwhile, was struggling even to replace its Midway losses. The construction of a single fleet carrier could take 2 years. By the time new hulls were ready, the technology aboard them was already outdated. In this sense, Japan was fighting not one war, but 2: the physical conflict at sea and the hidden industrial war of production rates, repair times, and technological renewal. In the latter, the outcome was already decided. In August 1942, American Marines landed on the island of Guadalcanal. The campaign that followed would become a brutal test of endurance, not only for soldiers, but for the entire Japanese logistical system. For the first time, Japan faced a sustained Allied offensive. To resupply its forces, the Navy organized nocturnal runs through the slot. Narrow waters infested with American aircraft and submarines. Every convoy risked annihilation. The Imperial Navy's surface ships, once symbols of power, became desperate transports, carrying fuel, food, and ammunition instead of shells and torpedoes. Fuel shortages grew worse. Destroyers were forced to operate on minimal loads. Battleships remained idle, their tanks dry, and still, Tokyo refused to adjust its doctrine. The Army and Navy operated in parallel, rarely coordinating logistics. Each service hoarded resources and guarded information. Where the Allies pooled intelligence, Japan compartmentalized it. Where America standardized, Japan customized, beautifully, inefficiently, fatally. By 1943, Japan's material losses were mounting. Over the Solomons, veteran pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. The once elite carrier air groups were now filled with young, barely trained aviators, men whose courage could not compensate for lack of experience. At the same time, American aircraft were evolving at a pace Japan could no longer match. The F-6F Hellcat, designed directly from combat data against the Zero, entered service that year. It was faster, tougher, and deadly at high altitudes. While Japan was still refining its earlier models, America was already on its next generation. The industrial gap had become a technological chasm. Even the once revered Zero began to show its age. Without advanced fuel and armor, its advantages diminished. Japan's inability to mass-produce improved engines or develop radar-assisted interception left its pilots increasingly blind and vulnerable. Behind these battlefield realities lay deeper structural decay. Japan's electronics industry remained fragmented, underfunded, and poorly integrated with military planning. The Navy's radar program was years behind its American counterpart. Factories lacked precision equipment. Copper shortages crippled wiring production. While the U.S. Navy could detect and track enemy ships at night, Japan's fleets still relied on human lookouts, eyes straining in the dark Pacific. In night battles, this difference was catastrophic. At Guadalcanal, American radar-directed gunnery transformed naval warfare. U.S. cruisers could open fire on unseen targets with deadly accuracy, while Japanese ships, unaware they'd been spotted, sailed straight into ambushes. Each engagement drained Japan's most irreplaceable resource, trained sailors and officers. By 1943, the Imperial Navy had lost not just ships, but the expertise to command them effectively. Yamamoto did not live to see the full extent of this decline. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted his travel itinerary, decoded from the same Japanese cipher system that had remained unchanged since before Midway. On April 18th, U.S. P-38 fighters ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. The man who had once embodied Japan's naval genius died in the jungle he had helped conquer. His death was both symbolic and prophetic. It marked the passing of the generation that believed Japan could outthink and outfight industrial modernity through spirit alone. In the years to come, that illusion would collapse entirely. Because by 1943, Japan's Navy was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. And the same 2 years it had lost before the war, those years of neglected innovation, slow adoption, and misplaced pride, had now become the empire's greatest debt, a debt it could never repay. That is how Japan's naval supremacy began to unravel, not in a single moment, but through the steady erosion of everything that once made it formidable. The empire still fought bravely, still built ships, still dreamed of reversal, but the gap between faith and physics was now unbridgeable. For every Japanese ship lost, America launched 3 more. For every pilot who fell, a dozen replacements took his place. And behind every American weapon was not just steel, but a system, industrial, scientific, and collaborative, that Japan had failed to build in time. The war that Japan had prepared for, the swift, decisive clash of fleets, was over. The war it now faced, of attrition, electronics, and endurance, was one it had already lost. By early 1944, Japan's empire still stretched across a vast portion of the Pacific, but it was an empire made of shadows. Fuel shortages paralyzed fleets. Aircraft production struggled against shortages of aluminum and rubber. And the once proud carrier air groups had become ghosts of their former strength. What had begun as an oceanic empire of confidence was now an archipelago of isolation. Japan's fleets could still fight, but not sustain. Its admirals could still plan, but not adapt. Every advantage that had defined the early war years, initiative, surprise, training, had evaporated. What remained was courage, and courage alone does not refuel ships. The first great demonstration of this new reality came in the skies over the Philippine Sea, June 19, 1944. Japanese naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, launched its last major carrier offensive. 9 carriers and more than 400 aircraft against the American Fifth Fleet. Admiral Raymond Spruance's task force was ready. Radar screens glowed in the darkness, detecting Japanese aircraft hundreds of miles away. American fighters, guided by radio and radar, rose in perfectly coordinated formations to meet them. What followed was later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The loss was not just numerical, it was existential. Most of Japan's remaining trained pilots died that day. The carrier decks that returned to Japan were nearly empty. The battle's outcome confirmed what Yamamoto had feared years earlier. Japan's qualitative edge had vanished, and the technological gulf had become absolute. The carriers that survived the Philippine Sea were soon drawn into another trap, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in human history. It was here, in these waters, that Japan's remaining strength met the full weight of America's industrial and technological might. The battle unfolded across 4 major engagements, each telling the same story in a different form: courage meeting inevitability. At Surigao Strait, Admiral Shoji Nishimura led his small force of battleships and destroyers into what he believed was a surprise attack on American invasion forces. Instead, American radar had tracked his approach for hours. As the Japanese formation advanced through the narrow waters, radar-directed gunfire erupted from 6 U.S. battleships and 8 cruisers. Shells, guided with mathematical precision, fell among the Japanese column. In less than 30 minutes, Nishimura's force ceased to exist. Both of his battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, went down under a storm of radar-guided fire. It was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was an execution carried out by technology. Nishimura's sailors never saw their enemy. The first warning they received was the sound of explosions tearing their ships apart. This was the new reality of warfare, where the ability to see defined the ability to live. American ships fought from beyond visual range. Japanese gunners, trained for optical precision, fired blindly into the dark. The old virtues of seamanship, sharp eyes, steady nerves, masterful optics, had been rendered obsolete. In their place stood electronics, computers, and coordination. Technologies Japan had underestimated and America had perfected. By the end of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was finished as an effective fighting force. Its once proud carrier fleet was a shell, ships without planes, planes without pilots, and pilots without fuel. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, engineering marvels meant to dominate any sea, became monuments to a vanished era. Musashi was sunk during the Battle of Leyte Gulf by relentless waves of American aircraft. Despite her massive armor and the courage of her crew, she could not withstand aerial attacks guided by radar coordination. Her sister ship, Yamato, would meet her fate months later in April 1945. Operation Tengo, Japan's final naval sortie, was a suicide mission. Yamato was ordered to sail toward Okinawa with barely enough fuel to reach it, without air cover, to beach herself and fight as a stationary fortress. She never made it. American reconnaissance detected her departure. Hundreds of carrier-based aircraft descended upon her in waves. For nearly 2 hours, Yamato fought back, her massive guns firing blind at enemies she could not see. When the end came, it came suddenly. Explosions ripping through her magazines, a tower of smoke rising 6 miles into the sky. Of her crew of more than 3,000, only a few hundred survived. In that moment, the age of the battleship ended. The future belonged to the carrier, the radar, and the machine. The collapse of Japan's naval power was not merely the loss of ships. It was the collapse of an entire worldview. The Imperial Navy had believed victory was earned through discipline, skill, and the indomitable spirit of its men. But the Pacific War had revealed a new kind of truth, that in modern warfare, systems outfight soldiers. America had built a system, an integration of research, production, and training that could replace losses faster than Japan could count them. When American ships returned from battle, they were repaired in days. When Japanese ships returned, they waited weeks for spare parts that no longer existed. By 1945, Japan's naval bases were silent. Shipyards lay in ruins, bombed by American B-29s. Fuel reserves were exhausted. The once mighty combined fleet had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Yet even in its death, the Imperial Navy fought with a tragic dignity. Destroyer captains refused to abandon their crews. Pilots volunteered for kamikaze missions, believing their sacrifice could somehow balance the scales. But courage, once again, could not overcome physics. Each kamikaze strike destroyed one ship at most. Each American carrier launched hundreds of aircraft every day. It was not a war of equals. It was a war between an empire of the past and an empire of the future. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the full scale of the technological imbalance became clear. American analysts studying captured documents found that by 1944, the United States had fielded radar systems nearly 5 years ahead of their Japanese counterparts. Their accuracy, range, and integration had rendered entire categories of Japanese tactics obsolete. Lieutenant Commander Omei, one of Japan's most analytical naval officers, later admitted that the Imperial Navy had entered the war 2 years behind and ended it 5 years behind. It was a gap that no amount of bravery could close. Lieutenant General Masatake Okumiya, a veteran of Japan's carrier forces, later wrote, "Our defeat was not caused by lack of courage, but by our failure to grasp the speed of modern war. Technology moved faster than we believed possible, and we moved slower than we dared admit." His reflection captured the essence of Japan's tragedy, that its warriors had been prepared for one kind of war, only to be consumed by another. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt itself from the ashes, its naval legacy transformed. The lessons of the Imperial Navy became the foundation of a new philosophy, one that valued integration, innovation, and continuous learning. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, that emerged decades later, would become one of the world's most technologically advanced fleets. A quiet acknowledgement of the past, and a testament to how deeply that past had been understood. The story of Japan's naval defeat is not simply one of loss, but of transformation. It is the story of a nation that discovered, too late, that technology, not tradition, defines survival in modern war. It is the story of how courage, discipline, and brilliance can be rendered powerless by the speed of innovation. And yet, it is also a story of respect. Respect for those who fought knowing the odds, who faced the impossible with honor, and whose sacrifice still echoes in the Pacific today. The Pacific War ended with Japan's navy silent beneath the waves, but its legacy endures, carved into history not just as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror for all great powers that forget how quickly the future arrives. Because in war, as in peace, the greatest danger is believing you have more time than you do. For Japan, those 2 lost years were everything, the years that cost an empire. In the end, Japan's fall was not written in a single battle. It was forged in 2 lost years of hesitation, when vision faltered and tradition triumphed over progress. History reminds us, empires don't collapse in defeat, they collapse in delay. If you value deeper, fact-driven World War II documentaries that go beyond the surface, subscribe now and stay with us, because the next story might change the way you see history itself.